May it please the court, I'm Greg Snowden and I'm representing the appellant, Mr. Holt. I will be arguing that prison officials have not met the burden of establishing that the grooming policy in question is the least restrictive means of furthering the government's compelling interest in prison security. I'm going to make my argument with three major points. First, prison officials provided no concrete evidence that they considered any alternatives to their grooming policy. Second, they provided no evidence of the significant disruption or burden that would be caused by Mr. Holt's request. And third, I will argue that the deference given prison officials is not intended to allow them to assert mere speculation as evidence. On to my first point. In Couchford v. Jabby, this required that officials demonstrate that they have considered least restrictive alternatives when restricting religious freedom. There is no such evidence in the testimony. Basically, prison officials just provided mere speculation and opinion that this was the best way to accomplish their goal.
Considering that these two officials have over 60 years of experience, wouldn't that be enough to establish that their speculation may be enough to have an expert take on this?
This is my argument, and basically that is not my argument. On the appellant side, we're saying that the burden of proof, regardless of the amount of expertise, requires that evidence be provided. And basically, in the court testimony, there is no evidence that these officials have looked at any other less restrictive means, and hence they're not able to provide any evidence. So with all due respect, we reject that argument. And again, the second thing is, when presented with least restrictive alternatives, which we clearly have in US v. Playboy, it requires that officials must prove that the less restrictive policy will be less effective. Again, the prison officials have offered no such evidence other than their mere speculation that that wouldn't work well. It's very important for the court to realize that while the legislative history of the law in question and precedents such as the Cutter decision do require that due deference be given to the prison officials, they still are required to meet the burden, to quote both the precedent and the law, of providing evidence that this is the least restrictive means possible. By providing no evidence that they have examined any less restrictive policy and providing no evidence specifically as to how a less restrictive policy will be less effective in security, it is our argument that they have not met that burden.
Counselor, do you think the statute requires that that the prison officials consider several alternatives? Does it inherently require that?
I think the legislation in question, the legislative history, implies that they have to have looked at alternatives, because otherwise there would be no way they could meet the burden of evidence to prove least restricted means. But the circuit court in Couch versus Jabby clearly did say that alternatives needed to be addressed when restricting religious freedom. And again, that's one of the things this court is going to decide as to whether that is essential to meet that burden. So currently, court precedent does not require it. I am arguing that you should make that the requirement for that burden. Otherwise, to move on to my third point, really what you're saying is that due deference allows the prison officials just to merely speculate on the problems that this may cause.
Counselor, maybe to put it more precisely, do you think the words least restrictive inherently require that more than one alternative be considered?
I think in order to meet the burden of proof, the prison officials would have to show that they at least examined one alternative policy and then had specific evidence as to why that policy would not work.
Thank you.
Which leads me to my third point. Yes.
Counselor, are there any other examples within this prison specifically of beards ever being grown for any specific reasons or special reasons or exceptions in the system?
Well, as in court testimony, we clearly know that they allow for a 1/4-inch beard exception to the rule for medical skin conditions, and we are arguing that that shows that there is a less restrictive means of attaining prison security. Obviously, if you can allow certain prisoners to have a 1/4-inch beard and there is no negative impact on prison security, certainly for religious grounds, a less restrictive means of accomplishing that would to allow prisoners to grow a beard. In this case, because of the religious confines of Mr. Holt, his beard does need to be a 1/2 inch long. What prison officials have failed to show is how the difference between a 1/2 inch and a 1/4 inch, how that could possibly adversely affect prison security, which really brings me to my third and last point, that the legislative history of the law in question makes it clear that government officials must provide actual evidence, not mere speculation or exaggerated fear. This requirement is reinforced by the court's Cutter decision, in which the Supreme Court clearly said that evidence was required and mere speculation would not suffice. And so our main argument basically is that because of all three of these points, on the question of least restrictive means, the prison officials have failed to meet the burden that this is the least restrictive means. They have failed to do that because they have not provided any evidence that they have looked at alternative policies. They have not provided any evidence that a less restrictive policy would cause less prison security, and they have failed to demonstrate how they can allow a quarter-inch beard and that does not adversely affect prison security, while a half-inch beard that my client wants in the name of his religious freedom would create a prison security issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor.
Thank you, Counselor.
I thought it would be